This is Star Trek Resurgence. We're here on Xbox Series X. Be sure to like the video. Subscribing is great as well. So this is actually a very interesting take on Star Trek, and if you are a fan of the overall concept of what Star Trek is, the movies, the show, everything like that, I think you'll actually really appreciate what this game has to offer. So what are we getting here? 1080p, 30 FPS. So this game, it doesn't have necessarily the best specs, if that makes sense, but it is a game where you are lightly interacting with it. It's basically a Telltale-like game, if you remember those from back in the day, like The Walking Dead, Wolf Among Us, stuff like that. It's sort of along those lines. So I don't necessarily believe the technical constraints really do hold this back, as it is something that you are more lightly interacting with and playing with. So what exactly is this game? This is a narrative-driven adventure where you are performing light actions. This is something that literally anyone can play. If you are someone that can't play games, you never played a game before, this is like a basic thing to play. And if it's still too hard for you, there is literally a story mode that will do all of the heavy lifting. But yeah, this game, literally anyone can play it. It's that simple. You're just tapping buttons, making choices. Very, very straightforward. That doesn't necessarily sound too thrilling for someone that plays lots of different types of games, but again, it is that Telltale style of play where you are more kind of interacting with the narrative and making your choices and changing things. So the game is actually really, really long. It is actually I think 10 plus hours or something like that. It is actually a full set of movies, or kind of a long limited series. I kind of think of it as almost a limited series, a set sort of show. Contains narrative, you have a beginning and an end, so it's not it's just endlessly teasing stuff, but I mean, it's space, so space goes on. But yeah, this is actually a very, very intriguing game. Now, I don't know if it necessarily gets every element of the Star Trek universe right. There's a lot of very bratty people and stuff like that, and annoying people, but I do first want to mention that you're not going to get spoiled from anything in this too. I'm literally just showing the first 20 or so minutes of the game and doing my review and talking about it, because I thought that would be the least spoiler-filled sort of thing. But I will, at times, jump into certain topics within the game to talk about certain points, but I won't spoil, what happens with any of the characters, what happens with anything in the plot. But I do need to get across some points where it's something that doesn't quite feel Star Trek is someone got really mad when we wouldn't basically, commit genocide, and it's that's kind of against Starfleet's fundamentals. So stuff like that stuck out to me. But if you can look past that as there's moments of people complaining and fighting and bickering just for drama, to make the story more interesting. If you can look past that, I really do think that you'll actually have a ton of fun with this as a Star Trek game. It really does kind of feel like a 90s style Star Trek experience. It's got some jank to it. It's got some slightly rough edges, but I also think the game can look quite beautiful. I think it really captures the feeling, the atmosphere, and the style of Star Trek very effectively, and I felt like I was actually going through a Star Trek story. And I thought for the most part, again, outside of some of the spots where I was kind of I don't know if that fits into Star Trek, it did actually feel like it had the enthusiasm and the fun and the sense of exploration and the sense of focus that you should get out of a Star Trek property. I actually really quite liked it, story-wise, the characters, and what was going on. Don't know if I loved some of the characters' motivations or actions, but it was actually an intriguing thing where your actual choices did have impactful elements to them. Long-lasting, impactful moments. I'm not sure I necessarily loved all of the kind of forced, kind of situations that would arise, but I did feel when I made a choice in this, the choice actually echoed across the game. the choice actually had an impact on the characters. You could not please everyone. Like, you actually had choices that would impact the story. I don't know if it would like wildly change the narrative in regards to like if you do certain choices here or there, it's not going to go off on a completely different adventure, if that makes sense. But it does really impact how different characters see you, where different characters end up, and what happens to certain characters. And I thought that was really intriguing. Now, this is also a game with a split. You've got this sort of high-ranking individual here. You're seeing her walk around. You know, this is kind of your main perspective. So this is Jara Rydick. And then you also have, on the flip side, Petty Officer Carter Diaz. So Diaz is like an engineer. So he works on sort of the smaller behind-the-scenes things, but obviously it's a Star Trek adventure, so things will go spiraling off into the craziest of, you know, situations. But it's kind of like a split. He has more, I want to say more action sequences, more, well, you know, Jara does too. She actually has some pretty crazy moments that pop up. But sort of like Diaz is sent into the thick of it, whereas Rydick is more of, you're making commanding choices, you are making political choices, you are influencing what's going on within the narrative, you are focused on like, okay, what are we doing? What is the direction here? You are high up. Like, you are actually getting to do some really cool command level things, which is awesome. And you're directly working with some iconic Star Trek characters that pop up throughout the story. I won't spoil them, but there's some fun stuff in this one, and you'll be like, oh, that's cool. Some characters you don't want to disappoint, but you might disappoint with your choices, depending on what you make. But that is the fun of it, too, is actually making these choices. And these characters, both characters that you play as, have their own set of, like, influence things. So you can pause and you can take a look at, like, how each character you've come across sort of sees you and sees the decisions you've made across the narrative. I think that in itself is just really quite fascinating. There is also a website that you can check your stats and stuff on. I think that one's a little buggy and whatnot, but that's a neat extra layering. Although I would have liked that to be more directly implemented into the game, like Telltale stuff has. So I right away know what others have like made choice-wise, but it is a neat extension if you do want to take the concepts of, you know, kind of this story a little bit further. It's kind of cool. So yeah, from a story perspective, I really did like the different things. You know, you've got Diaz and his close companions really thinking like engineers, really thinking like, you know, people to people. You know, there might be some romance stuff, nothing too deep. But, you know, there's that kind of themes there. And, you know, you've got these characters that are sort of in a different situation. And then you've got the more high-end staff. So he represents sort of like lower deck type, I don't know if you'd say straight up, but you know what I mean? Like, he is the worker, he is the engineer, he is fixing stuff. And then Rydick is making tactical decisions, making crew decisions, making like really intense life or death situation choices. And that is really intriguing, just to kind of like bounce back and forth between these different characters and see how their different personality, different styles kind of come into play. It's really, really intriguing because you get to see the different perspectives of a Star Trek experience. Kind of like you would depending on the property of Star Trek you're playing, but like watching or interacting with, right? Although a lot of Star Trek is typically like, you know, the command is where all the exciting stuff is, so you see that perspective. You know, there's things like Lower Decks, which I personally love, where you get to see a little bit of different stuff, but it's still, you know, it's interesting to see something where it's like you're actually, you know, doing like work type stuff and then things spiral and go wild. And I don't know if this gameplay even shows this off the best. Like, it does, it starts slow. You know, it is a slow sort of burn. It's like, okay, it sets the scene. There is some padding in this. I would have liked it if they would have maybe tightened it up a little bit more. But by the end of it, I really thought there was some great action buildup, great tension, great payoff. You know, there was some epic moments. You got to do some really cool stuff within the Star Trek universe. If you've ever wanted to like really kind of be at the command of making the big choices, the command of like doing some of the fun stuff in Star Trek. This game absolutely has cool things like that. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And you're also stuck in this situation where you've kind of been thrown into a perspective of conflict, you know, depending on, you know, which perspective you are as a character. Like if you're Rydek, you are like a new face on this ship, and not everybody really kind of like loves you and stuff like that. So you have to deal with that kind of situation and whatnot. And there's no free roaming. It is linear. It is a storytelling game. I know some people really wanted to actually like explore the ship. You're not doing that in this. It is a set story that you work through. But yeah, it is really quite interesting where you are on one perspective, someone everybody knows, you know, Diaz, and then another perspective, you are an outsider thrown into the midst of a ship in chaos, a ship being refitted, a ship that has a dangerous mission, and things continue to spiral out of control. And you're, you know, you've got problems, you got issues. Like, the other thing is there actually feels like there's depth to the characters. Like, there actually feels like there is backstory, things that have happened. These people actually feel fleshed out, like a lot of them do. And this does have a lot of different characters from different Star Trek species represented here. And you get to, like, interact with a lot of them in different ways, and you get to see changes, and you get to see perspectives, and it is really quite, again, I think, to the spirit of Star Trek, a lot of it, and a lot of fun and a cool narrative within the Star Trek universe. It may seem as though some stuff might be slightly off-putting to those, you know, in regards to some of the mentions I made, where it's like, well, that's not Star Trek, but, you know, again, they do need to manufacture drama and excitement in order to make something that is more compelling. I think this might be tougher to get into if you don't have like an appreciation of Star Trek and the lore. Like, there's lots of nods and things like that. I do think if you want a fun story where you are directly impacting the course of like a ship and the people within the ship, you will like this sort of story. If you like the Telltale games, you'll like this sort of thing. Just keep in mind that there is some irrationality in regards to how, you know, some, you know, decisions and stuff are made where you're kind of like, that was weird. But, like, you know, people are irrational too, I guess you could say, as well. So it's light interactions, it's light integrations. Visually, I do actually think the game does look kind of nice, you know, a lot of the time. Like, it really does, you know, aesthetically capture, like, Star Trek, you know, the uniforms, the ship design, the enemies. There's some really beautiful alien-like areas that you get to visit and see, and it does have some really cool callbacks to, you know, sort of the Star Trek lore and universe that it's in, again, with some, like, kind of teases of characters, but also some introductions and connections to, like, particular eras of Star Trek. So it's kind of set in the Next Generation era, so, you know, some of the characters and whatnot will sort of be a part of that, fit into particular, you know, narrative lines. If you have actually watched certain episodes, there is like a direct connection and fleshing out of a particular, like, species and everything like that, and it's really, really quite cool to see that going on. I wasn't quite as familiar with the characters that are kind of being used here from, like, a dramatic standpoint, so I did have to look into that a bit more. And even then, I think that this game probably fleshes out that society more than even the shows did, because it was such a one-off thing that they are using within this game. But yeah, it actually did kind of work. It's really, really quite intriguing. And, you know, I think they do get all of those little smaller fun details where if you are a big Star Trek fan, you're going to be like, oh, this is awesome, or that's cool. And like I said, if you don't even play video games, this one is light interaction. Like, you are just more or less interacting with an ongoing... It's an interactive movie, essentially, is what this is. And that may not sound really exciting to everyone, but it is actually pretty fun. There is good tension, there's good plot. You just gotta let it kind of build. Like I said, a slow burn. You gotta kind of let this one sort of get going. And then once it does, it's just action, action, action. Now, I would have liked to have some scene selections for replay would have been nice. Maybe some skipping of segments would have been awesome. So maybe those will be added later. That would be really great, just to make like replays a little bit more interesting. Because like I said, some segments of this do feel a little padded out, where I'm like, we could have skipped this could have been tightened. But you know, that's because it is a lengthy story. But if you do want a full, your value, this is long. This does actually provide a lot of stuff. You go to a lot of places, you see a lot of things. And there are like subtle hidden surprises, subtle hidden things where you're kind of like, oh, this is really intriguing. And you get to enjoy the fun of space, the final frontier, and the voyages of and stuff like that is really, really quite cool. So I think they did deliver something a little bit fresh. I didn't even know this was really a thing until I got to go and play it and stuff like that. And even then I was kind of like, oh, I don't know how I feel about this. And the beginning is kind of like, oh, it's a little, like I said, janky. It's a little like, yeah. But it all played well. I didn't have any problems, any technical hiccups or anything like that on the platform. Everything just kind of ran smoothly. It was fine. The graphics aren't, mind-blowing. They aren't necessarily up to current gen standards, but it's fun. It's got cool vibes. I like the diplomacy elements of it. I like that there's politics. I like that there's action. They've got a little bit of something for everyone from different elements of say Star Trek, or even outside of that, sci-fi interaction. You are making choices that impact your crew members. You are making choices that will really, really change the course of this. And I don't know if the overall Star Trek universe, but it does sort of plot an interesting perspective, and it does really reintroduce a sort of one-off type thing, but in an interesting new way, and you get to dive in deeply there. But you can tell that there is a passion for Star Trek. They get the little things, I think, right. It's just can you deal with the irrationality of some individuals and whatnot? That again becomes a big thing for me. Whereas I could definitely see some Star Trek fans, and even myself, kind of sitting here where I'm not super serious like some people are, but I would even go with some of the characters and being this is not how a starship it should be run. This is not. A lot of these characters are not following what you're supposed to do, protocol and everything wise, or they're not, they're acting weird for what Star Trek crew is supposed to be. But I also do realize that it is trying to tell a story. You do need drama, you do need manufactured conflict, you do need problems. That's what makes stories interesting for people. So I look over that kind of stuff. I think it's okay. I definitely give it a pass in that regard. So I think this is a really solid, fun, engaging, narrative-driven adventure. I hope the gameplay doesn't tire you out too much. It's more of a taste of it, because again, really, I didn't want to spoil this game. I could have shown something more action-packed halfway through, but I feel it would almost give away too much. So it was just literally filming the beginning of it, just so you could see some of the characters, just so you could see a bit of how the interactions work and what you do in this, and some of the mini-game type stuff for how you interact and get things done. But this is what the game is. You make choices, you impact the lives of your crew, you get to see two unique perspectives. You get to be diplomatic, you get to be a force that's battling and phasering, you get to explore, you get to solve mysteries, you get to solve puzzles, and it's kind of really does hit some of the more fun, still scenic moments of what a Star Trek adventure can be, and I think it's one of the more enjoyable Star Trek sort of stories that I've seen in recent years. It's actually well handled, and I'd love to see this kind of expanded upon and see more adventures like this, because it just actually does work well.